Stan Lee first came up with the idea for Spider-Man because of his desire to create a character that teenagers can identify with. Lee sought to create a more relatable kind of hero, one who had to deal with everyday problems like work, school, and relationships. While most superheroes seem to live enviable lives, Peter Parker's superpowers were more like a curse. Instead of improving his life, they made it more difficult. This rubbed Marvel publisher Martin Goodman the wrong way, and Lee ultimately had to agree to debut the character in the last issue of the fledgling science fiction anthology comic Amazing Adult Fantasy in order to overcome Goodman's objections. Amazing Fantasy number 15 would go on to sell over 1 million copies, and the character would return in his own title 7 months later. Spider-Man has gone on to become Marvel's flagship character and one of the most enduring figures in pop culture. I first started reading Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's run on Spider-Man about 4 years ago, in my attempt to become better acquainted with the histories of some of my favorite superheroes. I went into this run with the understanding that certain elements would be somewhat dated, and I appreciated how forward-thinking Lee and Ditko were for including serialized elements and more grounded drama in their stories. Because of the serialized nature of these stories, I decided to present this list in chronological order and to rank it only at the end of the video. I want to start out with a few honorable mentions. Firstly, there is Face to Face with the Lizard from Amazing Spider-Man number 6. This story is not paced the best, and it's strange having Peter operate in Florida instead of New York, but I really like how they fleshed out the villain here more than they usually do. Kirk Connors is really sympathetic. He created the lizard formula simply to grow his arm back, and he has a family who really cares about him and is horrified to see him turn into this monster. Spider-Man helps him to cure himself, and Connors would show up later in other Spider-Man stories as an ally. My other pick is Once Upon a Time There Was a Robot from Amazing Spider-Man number 37. This story, which sets up Norman Osborn as a potential villain for Spider-Man, just missed making my list. Without further ado, I now present my top 10 Stan Lee, Steve Ditko Spider-Man stories. Fair warning, this list contains spoilers. My first pick is, of course, The Origin of Spider-Man, originally published in Amazing Fantasy number 15. You all know the story by now. Peter Parker is a shy, nerdy teenager who lives with his Aunt May and Uncle Ben and is ridiculed by his classmates at Midtown High. On a field trip to General Tektronix Laboratories East, he is bit by a radioactive spider, granting him superhuman, spider-like powers. Elated by his newfound abilities, he enters a wrestling match and wins $100. He then creates the costumed identity of Spider-Man and becomes a local celebrity. One day, he encounters a fleeing thief on the way out of a TV studio, and, filled with apathy toward a world that's only ever been cruel to him, he lets him escape. Sometime later, his Uncle Ben is murdered, and Peter, filled with the desire for vengeance, tracks down his killer, only to find that it's the same thief he let escape. Filled with grief and guilt over his uncle's death, Peter turns the killer over to the police and walks off into the night, having learned that with great power comes great responsibility. Ditko's Spider-Man is not your average superhero. He's spindly and strange, spider-like in many ways. He imbues Peter Parker with real humanity and emotion. Similarly, Lee's storytelling is distinct from a traditional superhero origin. This feels almost like something out of Archie or a Twilight Zone episode. Indeed, by the end of the story, our protagonist isn't really even a superhero yet. Spider-Man's origin is really a remarkable piece of sequential storytelling. In the span of a mere 12 pages, Lee and Ditko create a compelling story of a teenager who learns too late about power and responsibility, a lesson that will haunt him for the rest of his life. More than 50 years worth of Spider-Man stories all rest on the foundation that Lee and Ditko created here. My next pick is Return of the Vulture, originally printed in Amazing Spider-Man number 7. Early Spider-Man stories usually focused on some villain gaining powers or escaping prison, and then causing havoc that Spider-Man would then have to deal with. Generally, the villain would elude him initially, forcing Peter to improvise some solution to defeat him later on. This story plays with that formula to deliver what I think is the best of these type of stories. In it, the Vulture, originally introduced in Amazing Spider-Man number 2, escapes from prison and perfects the design for his wings, allowing him to subvert Spider-Man's anti-magnetic inverter. Spidey goes into the first battle with the Vulture with great confidence, thinking incorrectly that he'll beat him the same way as before. As a result of this, the Vulture is able to surprise him with his newly modified wings, and Spidey is defeated by him, breaking his arm in a freefall. This, of course, creates more problems for Peter, as he has to make up an excuse for his broken arm. I appreciate that Peter's woes in this story are a direct result of the plot, as opposed to a side problem for the hero. When the Vulture tries to rob Jameson, Peter is forced to fight him with his broken arm, though he's careful to cover this up so as not to arouse suspicion. It's really fun watching Jameson try to talk his way out of giving his money to the Vulture, and then reacting to the fight, which destroys his office. Seeing him and Spidey interact after the fight is over is really hilarious and classic Spider-Man. The fight between Spidey and the Vulture is really cool, and I like the innovative way Spidey finally beats him. This story is also the beginning of Peter's relationship with Betty Brant, and it's great to see Peter being more assertive here. This issue in many ways foreshadows the direction Lee would take the character during his college years. Though there's not a lot of great character stuff in this issue, it does offer a really fun, action-packed story. I especially love the art during the fight scenes. I mean, look at some of these panels. They're like something out of a movie. My next pick is The Enforcers, originally printed in Amazing Spider-Man number 10. As the run progressed, it became more and more serialized, and Peter's relationship with Betty Brant, and later Liz Allen as well, would play an increasingly important role in the drama. This issue is especially continuity-driven. It continues with plot threads set up in previous issues, like Aunt May getting a blood transfusion from Peter and Liz and Flash's warming toward him, and most importantly, the secret that Betty Brant has kept from him. It also establishes characters and new plot threads that will be important later on. In this story, Peter discovers that Betty owes money to a criminal organization run by the Big Man, who is the antagonist of this issue. She refuses to explain this to Peter, so he investigates himself, eventually confronting the Big Man and fighting his henchmen, the Enforcers. The true identity of the Big Man is a mystery that runs throughout this story, with Spider-Man suspecting Jameson at one point. Later in the issue, Peter gets himself captured by pretending to know the Big Man's identity, and he fights and captures the Enforcers. The Big Man flees, only to be seen driving away by the police, who identify him as Friedrich Foswell, a reporter for the Bugle introduced earlier in the issue. The story ends by revealing why J. Jonah Jameson hates Spider-Man so much. Deep down, he admires the hero, but, as a self-serving person, he won't accept the fact that selfless, sacrificing people like Spider-Man really exist. The Enforcers presents a really compelling mystery, while also continuing the drama of the series as a whole. It begins to really flesh out supporting characters like Betty Brant and J. Jonah Jameson. The Enforcers themselves are a lot of fun, and there's just enough drama with Peter and Betty to make the story a little more compelling than usual. Once again, Steve Ditko really kills it with the action sequences, really showing off each of the Enforcers' unique skill sets, which present a compelling physical challenge for our hero. My next pick is Turning Point, originally published in Amazing Spider-Man number 11. Though it's not really a two-parter, Amazing Spider-Man number 11 picks up where the last issue left off. In this story, Dr. Octopus is released from prison for good behavior, and Peter invents a spider tracer to track his activities. When he sees him get into a car with Betty, he decides to follow him to Philadelphia. It is then revealed that Betty's brother, Bennett, is in debt to a gangster named Blackie Gaxton, who has hired Doc Ock to break him out of jail. Peter confronts Betty and gets her to tell him what she's mixed up in. He's too late to prevent the jailbreak, but goes to the docks to rescue Betty and her brother. He fights Gaxton's men despite having sprained his ankle, and Bennett is killed in the ensuing chaos while trying to protect Betty. She blames Spider-Man, who, incensed, proceeds to round up Blackie in his game and to fight Dr. Octopus, who escapes. The story ends with Peter attending Bennett's funeral. Betty reveals that she no longer blames Spider-Man, but hopes to never see him again as he reminds her too much of Bennett. Peter, who is considering revealing to Betty that he is Spider-Man, is heartbroken. Turning Point is one of the more dramatic stories in the run. Not only does a major character die, but Peter's remorse over losing Betty is really palpable, as their relationship had been built up through many issues before this. Ditko's art really sells the emotion. Whether it's a close-up or a more subdued, moody wide-angle, his art has a really heavy, emotionally charged quality here that the story really benefits from. My next pick is The Sinister Six, originally printed in Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 1. Most of the annual issues in this run focus on Spider-Man interacting with other characters in the Marvel Universe, like Doctor Strange, or simply reprinted older stories. But this first annual, printed in 1964, is another story. Here, Spider-Man is really put through the ringer as he has to face 6 of his most deadly villains. Dr. Octopus brings together Electro, Kraven the Hunter, Mysterio, the Sandman, and the Vulture to form the Sinister Six. Together, they plot to bring down Spider-Man once and for all. This story heightens the stakes by having Doc Ock kidnap Aunt May and Betty Brant. Peter, who starts the story by losing his powers, must face each of these villains one by one. When we first see Peter in this story, he is feeling really guilty about Uncle Ben's death and regrets getting his powers in the first place. This causes him to literally lose his powers due to psychosomatic trauma. When he finds out that Aunt May and Betty have been kidnapped, he decides to face the Sinister Six without his powers. When he does, facing Electro first, his powers come back. The need to save the people he loves reignites his dormant spider powers. Jameson, who is tasked with luring Spider-Man to the danger in order to lure him in, spends the story frantically trying to locate him, which is really entertaining. The only problem I have with this story is that Aunt May is so oblivious to what's going on. It's kind of hilarious, actually. She seems to think that Dr. Octopus is just a kind old man who's inviting her and Betty Brant over for tea. This will become an important and, in my opinion, unfortunate feature of a character later on, as she becomes Ock's housekeeper and he even tries to marry her at one point. I'm probably starting to sound like a broken record, but Steve Ditko's art is really great once again. He really sells Peter's remorse and regret early in the story, and does a good job conveying a sense of danger and suspense when he loses his powers. The action, of course, is spectacular, with Peter fighting each villain one by one on a different location, the battle usually ending in a dramatic splash page. This first Spider-Man annual encapsulates a lot of what's great about this run, though it also highlights some of its shortcomings. My next pick is The End of Spider-Man, originally published in Amazing Spider-Man number 17, 18, and 19. Nearly 3 years before the iconic Spider-Man No More, Lee and Ditko wrote this 3-part story where Peter nearly gives up being Spider-Man. In the first part, entitled The Return of the Green Goblin, Flash Thompson starts a Spider-Man fan club and invites Spidey to the first meeting. Green Goblin, getting wind of this, decides to show up as well and challenge the costumed hero. Fortunately, in the middle of his fight with the Green Goblin, Peter finds out that his aunt has fallen ill and runs away from the fight to be with her, leaving the Human Torch to subdue him. This makes Spider-Man look like a coward in the eyes of the people, and Jameson takes advantage of this to vindicate his constant attacks on the hero. Meanwhile, Betty is upset because Peter did not invite her to the meeting and believes he went with Liz Allen instead. In the second part, The End of Spider-Man, Jameson continues his attacks on the hero, gloating about his cowardice in his paper and on television. Meanwhile, Peter is struggling to pay for Aunt May's medicine. He encounters the Sandman, only to run away from the fight, fearing that he will be injured and unable to support Aunt May, and this only makes him look like more of a coward. With all this going on, Peter becomes fed up with being Spider-Man and nearly quits, only to be talked out of it by Aunt May, who says, "A person needs gumption, the will to live, to fight. We Parkers are tougher than people think." Meanwhile, Flash Thompson and Johnny Storm refuse to believe that Spidey is a coward, causing one to try and meet Spider-Man to let him explain, and the other to dress up as the costumed hero, in hopes that he'll be attacked, and Spidey can come to the rescue, vindicating himself. In the concluding part, Sandman, along with the Enforcers, captures the Torch, and Spider-Man comes to the rescue, redeeming himself in the eyes of Johnny Storm and of New York. This is the first multi-part story of the run. It continues to explore the relationship and rivalry between Spider-Man and the Human Torch and between Peter and Flash Thompson. It's a great example of a story that puts Peter through the ringer psychologically, only to see him take heart and rise above the occasion. Once again, Ditko's art is great throughout this arc. Jameson really looks more despicable, Peter more pitiful, or Spidey more determined than they do here. My next pick is SpiderMan Goes Mad, originally printed in Amazing Spider-Man number 24. My favorite one-and-done story in the run, SpiderMan Goes Mad is a really great mystery. In it, a psychologist named Dr. Ludwig Reinhardt tells J. Jonah Jameson that he has studied Spider-Man and determined that he's insane. This makes Peter question his sanity, and he begins to have hallucinations and almost goes into shock, making him even more uncertain. He finally goes to Reinhardt for help. Meanwhile, Flash Thompson suspects Peter of trying to steal Liz Allen from him, and is also mad at Jameson for always attacking Spider-Man in his paper. When he sees Jameson, who has received a mysterious warning about the doctor from Foswell, who I should probably also mention has been released from prison and is working for the Bugle once again, he begins to pester him about this, and he, Jameson, and Spider-Man are all present for the finale. It's finally revealed that Reinhardt is actually Mysterio, who has cooked up this whole plan in order to trick Spider-Man into revealing his identity. This issue is really entertaining. All the stuff with Flash and Jameson is really great, and Ditko is at his absolute best here. The panels in Reinhardt's office offer a lot of eye candy, and he's able to convey Peter's panic really well. It's also just a really great mystery thriller. Most Spider-Man stories reveal the villain's plan right from the beginning, but this one leaves you in the dark for much of the issue. My next pick is The Green Goblin vs. the Crime Master, originally published in Amazing Spider-Man number 26 and 27. By this point in the run, Lee and Ditko were really getting the hang of serialized storytelling. They had created a great sense of mystery surrounding the identity of the Green Goblin, and here they introduce a new masked crime boss, who Spider-Man suspects may be Friedrich Foswell. In the first part of this story, The Man in the Crime Master's Mask, the Crime Master and the Goblin, who had been working together, part ways, as the Crime Master wants to run the criminal underworld himself. He then proceeds to threaten various crime bosses until they agree to accept his leadership. Peter, meanwhile, is going through his usual struggles balancing his double identities. He lost his Spider-Man costume to Jameson in the previous issue, while Aunt May confiscated his backup costume. Betty is mad at him for encouraging Jameson to use a robot against Spider-Man and for showing interest in Liz Allen. Flash is also angry at Peter for making moves on his girl. Of course, Peter isn't really interested in dating Liz, but only wanted to help her with her studies. Discouraged in his attempts to retrieve his costume and to patch things up with Betty, Peter decides to start tracking Friedrich Foswell, who he still mistrusts. Meeting the Crime Master at Foswell's apartment, he begins to suspect that the former big man is really the Crime Master, or perhaps the Green Goblin. Finding a section of the waterfront marked off on a map, he decides to investigate. There he discovers a meeting of the criminal underworld, called by the Crime Master, and runs into the Goblin, who wants revenge on the mysterious criminal for double-crossing him. He and Spider-Man fight each other, and ultimately, Spidey is captured by the Goblin. In the second part of the story, entitled Bring Back My Goblin to Me, the Green Goblin tries to use his capture of Spider-Man to take over the criminal underworld, but Spidey escapes and the police, called in by a stool pigeon called Patch, arrive on the scene, leading to a massive battle. The Goblin flees, and Spider-Man chases the Crime Master through the sewers, only to lose his trail. He is killed in a shootout with the police, and it's revealed that he was a criminal named Nicky Lucky Lewis, who Foswell knew in his time as the Big Man. The story ends by revealing that Foswell was actually Patch, the stool pigeon, leaving the Goblin's identity a mystery. This is just a really exciting two-part story. It's really cool seeing Spider-Man do some genuine detective work, even if the ultimate revelation of who the Crime Master is a bit underwhelming. The big cliffhanger at the end of the first part is one of the best in the run. The second part is just a fun, action-packed issue, though it does run out of steam by the end. Needless to say, Ditko's art is great throughout the story, particularly during the big fight sequences. By this point, he was receiving credit for art and for plotting. My next pick is If This Be My Destiny, originally published in Amazing Spider-Man number 31, 32, and 33. One of the most acclaimed Spider-Man stories of all time, including If This Be My Destiny on this list, was a no-brainer. In the first part of the story, entitled If This Be My Destiny, Spider-Man tries to stop a group of masked criminals, working for the mysterious Master Planner, from stealing an atomic, radioactive device only for them to escape. Unfazed, Peter proceeds to register for college the next morning, only to find that Aunt May has fallen ill when he returns home. In order to pay her medical bills, he hopes to find some action as Spider-Man, so he can sell the photos to the Daily Bugle. J. Jonah Jameson, meanwhile, is thirsty for a story and sends Foswell to dig up some news. Disguised as Patch, Foswell learns of yet another robbery planned by the Master Planner, and he informs both Spider-Man and the police. Spider-Man once again confronts the gang only to have them escape once more. The issue ends by revealing that Aunt May's illness is terminal. In Part 2, entitled Man on a Rampage, it's revealed that the Master Planner is really Dr. Octopus, who hopes to increase his power by stealing radioactive materials. Peter is told that Aunt May has a radioactive particle in her blood, which, he realizes, she must have got from him when he gave her a transfusion in issue number 10, making him even more desperate to save her. He goes to Dr. Curtis Connors, who he cured from being the Lizard, for help in neutralizing the radioactivity. He tells Spider-Man that he'll need a new serum called ISL-36, which Peter sells all of his lab equipment to purchase. Unfortunately, Doc Ock also wants the serum for his experiments, and his men steal it before it can be delivered to Dr. Connors. Spider-Man spends the rest of the issue furiously tracking down the Master Planner's gang in order to retrieve the serum. In a stroke of blind luck, he finally stumbles on their underwater hideout, and he confronts Doc Ock. Fighting him in a fit of rage, he accidentally causes the chamber to collapse and becomes pinned under some heavy machinery. In the final chapter, which is literally called the final chapter, Spider-Man is still pinned under the machinery and running out of energy. Meanwhile, the chamber is flooding with water, and Aunt May's life is ticking away. In one of the most iconic sequences in comic book history, Spider-Man finds the strength to lift the rubble off himself. He then, almost blindly, fights off the rest of Doc Ock's gang and escapes to deliver the serum to Dr. Connors. Of course, they eventually come up with a cure and save Aunt May. Peter sells the pictures of his fight with Dr. Octopus to Jameson, allowing him to pay Aunt May's medical bills and to buy back his lab equipment. There are other plot threads running throughout this story. Peter starts college here, and Harry Osborn and Gwen Stacy are both introduced. Of course, Peter is so preoccupied with Aunt May's illness that he completely ignores his new classmates, an act they perceive as snobbery. It also continues the romance between Peter and Betty, who is torn between him and Ned Leeds. If This Be My Destiny is simply one of the best Spider-Man stories ever written. Sure, there are some plot contrivances, but the main drama is so compelling and ultimately inspiring that it almost doesn't matter. The personal stakes for Peter were never higher than they are here. Steve Ditko's art and plotting is of course really great. The famous sequence where Spider-Man is trapped under the beam is particularly powerful, as we see this character who is defined by a sense of responsibility, literally and metaphorically crushed under the weight of that responsibility. When he lifts that beam, it's like he's lifting the weight of the world off his shoulders. Lee and Ditko reach their absolute height here. My next pick is Just a Guy Named Joe, originally printed at Amazing Spider-Man number 38. Spider-Man villains were rarely fleshed out or sympathetic in the early days. This story is one of the few exceptions. In this story, Joe Smith, a down-on-his-luck boxer, gains superhuman strength during a freak accident while he's filming a movie. This also causes him to go into a mindless rage, striking out at the world that ridiculed him. Joe Smith parallels Peter in many ways. Most of Spider-Man's rogues gallery act as mirrors for the hero, showing how dangerous someone as powerful as Spider-Man could be without a moral center. Joe is even more like Peter because he's looked down upon by those around him, and he seemingly can't catch a break. But while Peter has his Aunt May to guide him, and the loss of his Uncle Ben is a constant reminder of his responsibilities, Joe only has his manager, who is well-meaning but not ultimately a great help. Of course, Spider-Man eventually comes face-to-face with Joe, and they fight multiple times. Peter is dealing with his own woes, as Betty Brant has left the Daily Bugle without explanation, and the kids at college continue to resent Peter for shrugging them off. Meanwhile, Norman Osborn, who's tired of Spider-Man's continual interference with his mysterious plans, has offered a substantial reward for his defeat, leading criminals throughout New York to attack Spidey. The story ends with Joe recovering from the effects of the accident and being cleared of all charges by his manager. He then gets a contract as a star for the movie company who hired him for a bit part at the beginning of the story. Spider-Man, meanwhile, fights off yet another group of criminals out for the reward money, and is left to mull over his foul luck, as it's announced on the television that Joe Smith has gotten the lead role in a new superhero TV show. Just a Guy Named Joe is the last Spider-Man story drawn by Steve Ditko, and it feels like the end of an era. When John Romita took over the art duties, Peter would become more assertive and less eternally depressed. In many ways, Ditko had helped Lee to lay the groundwork for the rest of his run. The Green Goblin had been set up. Peter was now in college and had a new supporting cast, and he and Betty Brant were moving apart. And now, as promised, the ranking of my top 10. Number 10, The Return of the Vulture from Amazing Spider-Man number 7. Number 9, Just a Guy Named Joe from Amazing Spider-Man number 38. Number 8, The End of Spider-Man from Amazing Spider-Man number 17, 18, and 19. Number 7, The Sinister Six from Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 1. Number 6, The Green Goblin vs. the Crime Master from Amazing Spider-Man number 26 and 27. Number 5, The Enforcers from Amazing Spider-Man number 10. Number 4, Turning Point from Amazing Spider-Man number 11. Number 3, Spider-Man Goes Mad from Amazing Spider-Man number 24. Number 2, If This Be My Destiny from Amazing Spider-Man number 31, 32, and 33. And finally, my number 1 pick. My favorite story from Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's run on Spider-Man is The Origin of Spider-Man from Amazing Fantasy number 15. I had a really difficult time deciding between my number 1 and my number 2. While I love If This Be My Destiny for its serialized and emotionally impactful story, Amazing Fantasy number 15 is simply one of the best told origin stories ever. In a mere 12 pages, Lee and Ditko laid the groundwork for an entire 50 years of Spider-Man history. It's a story that stands on its own, and for me has emotional resonance, even to this day. So that's the list, guys. Let me know if there's any stories from this run that you really love that I may have left out. And also, let me know if there's any other runs that you might want me to talk about. Thanks.